On the afternoon of July 14th, 2026, a satellite called NOAA-21 passed over eastern Canada and photographed something so large it defied the instrument's frame. A river of smoke, hundreds of miles wide, pouring out of the forests of Ontario and Quebec, sweeping east over Canada's biggest cities and spilling south across the border into the American Midwest and Northeast. Beneath that smoke, nearly 850 separate wildfires were burning at once. More than 180 of them in Ontario alone, dozens of them completely out of control. And here is the detail that makes this moment different from every other fire story you have heard. Just 5 weeks earlier, Canada's own federal government had released an update that sounded almost like good news. The 2026 fire season, it said, had started slowly. Slower than 2023, the worst season in the country's recorded history. Slower than 2025, the second worst. Barely 166,000 hectares had burned by June 10th. And then, in the space of a few searing weeks at the end of June, the season detonated. By July 9th, the burned area had exploded to 1.4 million hectares. 5 days later, 1.9 million. A heat wave settled over the country, drought tightened its grip on the north, and the official forecast for the rest of the summer, from the scientists whose job it is to know, pointed in one direction. Above normal temperatures across almost the entire country through August. The highest fire danger concentrated across the Northwest Territories, northern Manitoba, the lands around Hudson Bay, and the forests of northern Ontario and Quebec. The people who study fire for a living looked at that slow, quiet spring, and they did not relax, because they have seen this exact pattern before and they know what it means. A late starting season is not a mild season. It is a loaded one. Canada is burning again for the fourth year in a row at a scale that was considered nearly impossible a generation ago. And everything in the data says the worst of 2026 has not arrived yet. This is the story of why. Not the headlines, but the machinery underneath them. The reason a country with more freshwater lakes than any nation on Earth keeps going up in flames. If deep, honest investigations into real threats are why you are here, subscribe right now, because we go this far into the actual science every single week. To understand what is happening to Canada, you first have to understand what Canada is made of. Stretching across the entire country, from the Yukon to Newfoundland, lies the boreal forest, a belt of spruce, pine, fir, and birch so vast, it makes up roughly a quarter of all the intact forest left on the planet. It looks eternal. It is anything but. The boreal forest is not an ecosystem that merely tolerates fire. It is an ecosystem built by fire, shaped over thousands of years by a natural rhythm of burning and regrowth. The dominant tree across enormous stretches of it is the black spruce, and firefighters have a nickname for black spruce that tells you everything you need to know. They call it gasoline on a stick. Its needles are saturated with flammable resins. Its branches grow all the way down to the ground, forming a perfect ladder that carries flames from the forest floor straight into the crown. Its cones are sealed with wax that melts in extreme heat, releasing seeds into freshly burned soil, which means the tree does not just survive fire. It reproduces through it. For millennia, that arrangement worked because the fires came at a survivable pace. What has changed is not that Canada's forests burn. It is how often, how hot, how large, and how early. The reason is written in the thermometer. Canada is warming at roughly twice the global average rate, and its far north is warming faster still. Warmer air pulls more moisture out of soil, out of dead wood, out of the living trees themselves, converting an entire landscape into fuel. Snow melts earlier. Rain falls less reliably where it is needed most. The fire season that once ran from late spring to early fall now stretches weeks longer on both ends. And scientific attribution studies of the catastrophic 2023 season found that climate change had made the extreme fire weather behind it at least twice as likely and significantly more intense than it would otherwise have been. That is the stage. Now let me show you what has been performed on it. In 2023, Canada experienced the largest fire season in its recorded history, and the numbers still read like a misprint. Roughly 18.5 million hectares burned. That is an area larger than the entire country of Greece, consumed in a single season more than double the previous one. Record. More than 200,000 people were forced from their homes. Smoke crossed the border and turned the sky over New York City a choking apocalyptic orange, briefly giving the largest city in America the worst air quality of any major city on Earth. Plumes reached Europe, and when scientists tallied the carbon released by those fires, they found that Canada's burning. Forests had emitted more carbon in one summer than the annual fossil fuel emissions of almost every country on the planet. Only a small handful of industrial giants emitted more. A forest, in other words, outpolluted nations. Then came 2024, when fires that included the blaze that tore into the town of Jasper, Alberta, destroying roughly a third of its structures inside a national park visited by millions, burned over 5 million hectares. Then 2025, the second worst season ever recorded, When flames swept the prairie provinces, tens of thousands of people were evacuated across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Entire communities like Flin Flon emptied out, and 2 people were killed when fire overran a rural area east of Winnipeg faster than they could escape. 3 consecutive years. 3 of the most destructive seasons in the country's history, back to back to back. And now 2026, which lulled everyone with a quiet spring and is currently erupting exactly where the forecast said it would. Hold that sequence in your mind, because it is the pattern, not any single fire, that has scientists genuinely alarmed. Now, here's the first part of this story that almost nobody is telling. Some of the fires burning in Canada right now may not be new fires at all. They may be old ones that never died. Across the boreal north, the forest floor is not soil in the way most people picture soil. It is peat and duff, a dense, spongy layer of partially decomposed plant matter, in some places meters thick, accumulated over thousands of years. When a surface fire passes through, it can ignite that layer, and then something eerie happens. The flames disappear, but the fire does not. It burrows. It smolders downward into the peat, burning slowly without visible flame, insulated from rain and even from snow. Through the depths of a Canadian winter, under a meter of snowpack, at air temperatures of 40 below zero, the fire survives underground, creeping sideways through the organic soil for months. Scientists call them overwintering fires. Firefighters call them zombie fires. And when spring comes, when the snow melts and the surface dries, the zombie fire climbs back out of the ground and reignites the forest, sometimes miles from where it went under. After the record 2023 season, roughly 150 of these holdover fires reemerged from the ground as early as February of 2024, seeding the new season with the embers of the old one. Each catastrophic year now hands live ammunition directly to the next. The fire seasons are no longer fully separate events. They are beginning to connect underground. And that leads directly to the second thing almost nobody's telling you, the part that transforms this from a Canadian disaster into a planetary one. The boreal region is one of the largest carbon stockpiles on Earth, not primarily in the trees, but beneath them, in those same peatlands and frozen soils, where dead plant matter has been accumulating without fully decomposing since the last ice age. For 10,000 years, the boreal forest has functioned as a vault, quietly locking carbon away from the atmosphere. Fire picks that vault. When the peat burns, it releases carbon that took millennia to store in hours. And the carbon released warms the atmosphere further, which dries the forests further, which drives larger fires, which release more ancient carbon. This is what scientists call a feedback loop, a system that feeds on its own output. There is even evidence that some parts of the boreal forest, after repeated severe burns, are failing to grow back as forest at all. When fires return too quickly, they destroy the young trees in the seed bank before a new generation can mature, and the land flips to shrubs and grasses instead. Sections of one of the planet's great carbon vaults are being converted, fire by fire, into something that can never hold as much again. When you hear that Canada's fires matter to the whole world, this is precisely why. The smoke that reached New York was the visible signature of an invisible ledger being rewritten. The fires themselves have also begun behaving in ways that break the old rules of firefighting. When a blaze grows hot enough and large enough, it stops being merely a fire and starts functioning as a weather system. The superheated air above it rockets upward with enough force to build its own storm cloud, a towering monster called a pyrocumulonimbus, a fireborne thunderstorm that can climb to the edge of the stratosphere. These clouds generate their own lightning, and that lightning strikes down into the tinder-dry forest around the fire and ignites brand new fires, which means the blaze is literally spawning its own offspring miles ahead of its front line. They generate violent, erratic downdrafts that fling embers kilometers in unpredictable directions. In the most extreme cases, the rotating winds at a fire's edge have spun up genuine fire tornadoes. The record 2023 season produced more of these fire-generated thunderstorms over Canada than scientists had ever documented in a single season anywhere. There is no fire crew on Earth that can stand in front of that, and most of the time, no one tries. Because here is a truth about Canadian wildfire that surprises almost everyone. The overwhelming majority of the area that burns each year is ignited not by people, but by lightning, in countries so remote that no road reaches it, and much of it is not fought at all. It cannot be. The distances are too vast, the fires too many, the crews too few. Firefighters concentrate on the fraction of fires that threaten lives and communities, and even there, the system is stretched to its breaking point, leaning year after year on crews flown in from the United States, Mexico, Australia, South Africa, South Korea, and beyond. In 2026, for the first time, Canada's federal government has stood up a national fleet of leased firefighting aircraft, 10 planes backed by more than $300 million, precisely because the country has accepted that the old capacity is no longer enough. And if anyone tells you Canada has seen it all before, there is one piece of history worth knowing because it is both true and deeply misleading. In October of 1825, after a summer of freak heat and drought, a firestorm exploded across New Brunswick in what became known as the Great Miramichi Fire, one of the largest and deadliest fires ever recorded in North America. In a single night, flames driven by gale-force winds consumed an area of forest larger than some entire countries, obliterated towns along the Miramichi River, and killed at least 160 people, with some accounts suggesting far more, as survivors fled into the river itself and stood neck-deep in the water while the world burned around them. So yes, Canada has always been capable of catastrophic fire. That is exactly the point. Miramichi was a once-in-generations convergence of extreme heat, extreme drought, and wind. What the last 4 years show is that the atmospheric conditions, which were once a terrifying rarity, are becoming the recurring baseline, and a landscape that produces a Miramichi-scale season once a century does not get to survive producing one every other year. If you want to know what it looks like when this machinery reaches a town, you only need 3 names: Fort McMurray, Lytton, Jasper. In May of 2016, a fire the locals nicknamed the Beast swept into Fort McMurray, Alberta, and nearly 90,000 people, the entire city, evacuated in a matter of hours down a single highway, walled with flame, in the largest wildfire evacuation in Canadian history. Around 2,400 homes and buildings were destroyed, and it became the most expensive disaster the country has ever endured. In late June of 2021, the village of Lytton, British Columbia, recorded a temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius, over 121 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest temperature ever measured anywhere in Canada, a reading that shattered the national record 3 days in a row. The following day, a fire ignited and burned the town to the ground in minutes. 2 people died. And in July of 2024, flames driven by winds inside a fire cloud overran defenses that crews had spent days building and tore through Jasper, one of the crown jewels of the national park system. Each of these events was described at the time as unthinkable. Each has since been surpassed somewhere else. That is the trajectory hiding inside the word wildfire. Now, I need to be direct about something, because the internet version of this topic is drowning in it. Every summer that Canada burns, the same claims flood social media. That the fires are all deliberately set, that arsonists, or worse, secret-directed energy weapons, are the real cause, and climate is a cover story. Here is what the evidence actually shows. Our arson is real, and a small number of people are charged with setting fires in Canada in any given year. Human activity, mostly accidental abandoned campfires, sparks from equipment and vehicles, does ignite a large share of fires near roads and towns. But the enormous fires that drive Canada's record seasons, the remote monsters responsible for the overwhelming majority of hectares burned, are ignited by lightning in wilderness, where there is often no human being for 100 kilometers in any direction, and their ignitions are tracked by satellite and mapped publicly. No arsonist made the snow melt early across an entire subcontinent. No weapon dried a billion trees at once or overwintered underground in the peat. The conspiracy theories are not just wrong, they are a distraction from a harder and more useful truth, which is that some of this is within our control. Decades of aggressively extinguishing every small fire allowed unnatural amounts of fuel to build up in many forests, a debt now coming due. Communities can be hardened, fuels can be managed, and Indigenous nations across Canada practice deliberate, careful cultural burning for thousands of years, low-intensity fires set in the right season to keep the landscape open and resilient, a practice that was outlawed for a century and is only now being restored because science has caught up to what those communities knew all along. Blaming shadowy arsonists asks nothing of us. The real explanation demands everything. So what does the rest of 2026 hold? And why do the people closest to the data believe the worst may still be ahead? In the short term, the answer is written in the forecast. The hottest, driest core of the Canadian fire season historically runs through late July and August. And this year, that peak is arriving with above normal temperatures. Projected across nearly the whole country, entrenched drought in the Northwest Territories, where burned area is already running well beyond its 10-year average, dangerous dryness spreading through Manitoba and northwestern Ontario, and regions like Newfoundland and Labrador burning at more than 4 times their normal pace. The season's slow start means millions of hectares of fuel that would ordinarily have burned in spring are still standing, dry, and waiting. And in the long term, the answer is written in the physics. Every projection scientists publish points the same direction. Continued warming means longer seasons, more lightning, deeper droughts, and burned areas that could double again in the decades ahead. The 4 seasons Canadians have just lived through, 2023, 2024, 2025, and now 2026, are not an anomaly to be waited out. They are a preview. If you live in or near Canada's forest regions or anywhere downwind and half a continent is downwind, there are things that genuinely matter. Know your community's evacuation routes and have a go bag ready, because Fort McMurray and Jasper prove that the warning can be measured in minutes, not days. Harden your home the way the Fire Smart program recommends, clearing the flammable material from the critical meters around your walls, because embers, not flame fronts, destroy most buildings. And take smoke seriously, because it is the fire's longest arm. The microscopic particles in wildfire smoke penetrate deep into lungs and bloodstreams, and researchers studying the 2023 plumes concluded the smoke likely contributed to tens of thousands of premature deaths far beyond the fires themselves. On smoke days, check the air quality index like you check the weather, keep a proper respirator on hand, and filter the air in at least one room of your home. The people most likely to be harmed by these fires will never see a single flame. Canada is burning. That is no longer news. What matters now is understanding that this is not one bad summer or three, but a vast northern system, forest, peat, climate, and fire, shifting into a new and more dangerous state in real time, with consequences that reach every person breathing air in the northern hemisphere. The maps are being redrawn, the vault is leaking, and the season of 2026 has only reached its halfway point. Subscribe if you want to keep following stories like this one, told straight, with the real science and none of the hype. Drop a comment with the fact that surprised you most, and share this with someone in the path of the smoke. Because this is a story that people need to understand now, not after the next record falls. Before you go, there is one more dimension of this story worth sitting with, because it decides how the next decade actually unfolds. It is the question of who stands on the fire line. Canada's wildland firefighting force is, by every honest account, magnificent and exhausted. Crews now routinely work seasons that stretch from April into October, redeployed from province to province as each new region ignites, and the veterans among them describe fire behavior in the last 4 years that their 30 years of experience never prepared them for. Fires that run at night, which fires historically did not do because nights are no longer cool or humid enough to slow them. Fires that spot new ignitions kilometers ahead of themselves. Fires that burn through landscapes still blackened from 2 seasons before, which was once thought nearly impossible. Retention is falling, burnout is rising, and every major fire nation on Earth, the United States, Australia, the Mediterranean countries, is competing for the same shrinking pool of experienced crews during increasingly overlapping fire seasons, which means the international cavalry that Canada has leaned on may not always be available when multiple continents burn at once. That is the fragile human wall standing between these fires and the communities in their path. And it is why the most important developments are the quiet ones that never trend online. New aircraft fleets, year-round fuel management crews, Indigenous fire guardians returning good fire to landscapes that evolved with it, building codes and community buffers designed on the assumption that fire will arrive, not the hope that it won't. The boreal forest will burn. It always has, and no policy on Earth can stop that. What remains undecided is whether the burning stays a force the country can live alongside or becomes one it can only flee. Ask the people watching the smoke maps this July, with the hottest weeks of 2026 still ahead, and they will tell you that question is being answered right now.